What does the Middle East want from the U.S. presidential election? Some say when it comes to policy on Israel and Palestine, neither candidate can be trusted to stop the atrocities in Gaza. But with Trump, a personal friend of Benjamin Netanyahu, could bad get worse for Palestinians and the region if he's reelected? Or would a Harris administration simply maintain the same downward spiral? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is The Newsmakers. It was said after the fall of the Soviet Union that the U.S. was the only remaining global superpower. You can say that China is in the mix today, but still, everything Washington does, both economically and geopolitically, affects the entire world. So, of course, the entire world is watching the U.S. election very closely, but arguably no more acutely than in the Middle East. Conflict is rife in the region, and much of it is being driven by U.S. weapons and U.S. policy. So how might a Harris or Trump administration change the already volatile conditions for the better or for the worse? Here's a look now at the history of U.S. influence and interference in the Middle East.
For half a century, the United States has played a pivotal role in shaping the fate of the Middle East. After the Second World War, when shifting global dynamics forced Britain and France to relinquish their colonies, the US filled the power vacuum. To secure its economic dominance, access to the region's oil reserves was crucial. Washington's other two priorities were the protection of the newly formed state of Israel and containing Soviet influence. But seeds of distrust were sown early on. In 1953, the US and mostly the British orchestrated a coup in Iran to maintain control of its oil.
In the decades that followed, the U.S. increasingly gave support, though not always unqualified support, but increasingly support to the Shah of Iran, the last king of Iran, who became increasingly dictatorial in his rule.
Further animosity grew in the 60s as the US supported Israel's Six-Day War against multiple Arab states, which left Israel in control of Jerusalem, the West Bank, and other Arab territories. At the same time, the US continued its efforts to contain Soviet influence by expanding its presence and establishing military bases throughout the region. The 1983 Beirut barrack bombings, which killed 241 US and 58 French personnel, was another significant turning point. Iran was blamed, and the event marked the start of the clear demarcation between those countries supporting the US, such as Saudi Arabia, and those that did not, like Iran.
It's a great privilege to welcome a world statesman, a leader of Arab and Muslim people, and a good friend of the United States, His Majesty King Fahd bin Abdul Aziz Al Saud.
During the 90s and early 2000s, when the US was effectively the world's only superpower, it staged two Gulf wars against Iraq and invaded Afghanistan in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, where it stayed for over 20 years. But since then, as the US has become self-sufficient in oil and gas, it's reduced its engagement with the Middle East, and the emerging superpower China now vastly surpasses US economic involvement in the region. The US troop presence has also decreased, with currently just 900 soldiers on the ground in Syria and 1,600 in Iraq. The enormous US military bases, however, are a different matter. There are vast installations in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE, to name a few, and they still project US power in the region. Today, by far the most contentious US involvement in the Middle East is Washington's continued unwavering support for Israel.
We are going to continue to stand with Israel's right to defend itself. And let's be clear and never forget what happened on October 7th.
And when I'm back in the Oval Office, I will support Israel's right to win its war. And I will give Israel the support that it needs to win, but I do want them to win fast. Wouldn't it be nice if they could win fast?
While it calls for Gaza and Lebanon peace talks, the US provides vast sums of money and devastating weaponry to Tel Aviv. So with the upcoming US presidential election on a knife edge, the Middle East is left wondering whether Kamala Harris will continue President Biden's ineffective diplomacy, or if a prospective President Trump will give Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu carte blanche to do whatever his extremist government sees fit.
So is there a better alternative for the Middle East in this U.S. election? And if so, what would it be? And joining me now to debate that and more are, here with me in the studio, former advisor to the U.S.-led coalition forces against Daesh, Kadhim Al Waeli. From Washington, Palestinian-American political analyst Omar Baddar. From Boston, distinguished public policy fellow at the American University of Beirut, Rami Khouri. And from Detroit, director of the Abandon Harris campaign, Hassan Abdel. Salam. Thanks all so much for being with me. Hassan, I'm going to start with you because, everyone can understand why Palestinians and activists are angry with the Biden administration for its total lack of action against Israel in Gaza. But your strategy now is to basically punish Kamala Harris at the ballot box, knowing full well you're giving Trump a better chance of becoming president by doing that. Do you want Trump to win?
Our strategy is simple. It's to punish the vice president for her genocide in order for us to take the blame for her defeat, and in so doing buy power to send a signal to the political landscape that you can never engage in genocide and then win. We came out again and again and again this past horrifying year calling for a ceasefire, and nothing, silence.
And do you think Donald Trump would not endorse what Israel has been doing since the war on Gaza began?
We do not support Donald Trump or any genocider. The Democrat Kamala Harris, who has been engaging in a genocide, and then the candidate Donald Trump, who says that he's going to finish the job. What we have come to realize is we have been locked out and orphaned from the political landscape, and we have no other choice but to ensure that people see that we are influential. What has happened is that we cannot see ourselves going to the ballot and rewarding the person who has engaged actively in a genocide, that we can change the political landscape, both Republicans and Democrats. Seeing us as the deciders of the election is what we ultimately can do. We have also come to realize there is no such thing as someone engaging in a milder genocide. Genocide is genocide. There is no lesser evil. We're presented with a choice of supporting someone who has actively engaged in a genocide and another who wants to continue so.
Okay, Omar, would you agree there, or is it somewhat short-sighted? Because Israeli extremists, the settlers, are praying for Trump to win because they believe they'd actually have a chance of annexing Gaza and the West Bank. Do you think it's right to take that risk?
Yeah, it is a significant risk. There's no question about it. And I do think that you can't not want to punish the Biden-Harris administration for their absolutely contemptible and horrific policy for the past year. I mean, just arming and funding a genocide for an entire year without ever putting up any kind of meaningful opposition to it is just absolutely outrageous. That should be their legacy. It should haunt them until the end of time, and they should never have, never be able to live that down. At the same time, I do realize that there's a significant risk when Trump is promising yet again, as he has before, that he's going to come in and basically be even more anti-Palestinian, what that might look like in terms of allowing Israel to take over north of Gaza and make it officially part of Israel, in terms of allowing Israel potentially to carry on another genocide in the West Bank on a full-fledged scale, the way that they are currently carrying it out in Gaza. And also what he's promising in terms of domestic repression against advocates of Palestinian human rights, and the fact that he's essentially saying he's going to weaponize law enforcement and bring the full weight of the U.S. government against people who dissent on this policy. Now, if I had confidence that the Democrats would learn their lesson at the end of this, and come next election they're going to have much better policy, then that gamble would be worth it. But what I'm concerned about is that we've seen in previous elections, when progressives punished the Democrats back in 2016, there was the Bernie or bust movement, where they said because the Democrats did not play fair with Bernie and were not listening to progressives, we're going to punish them and we're going to sit out this election. And yet Trump's victory did not lead the Democrats to move further to the left. When it came to the following election, they nominated another centrist, and they screwed, burning over yet again. And that, to me, is a bit of a terrifying prospect of Trump coming in and making things meaningfully worse for people in Palestine, for people in the U.S., and potentially the Democrats not learning their lesson because the political system is so broken in this country that I don't have that confidence that they're going to have the analysis to say, okay, we've got to listen this time. And I also don't know what 4 years of this genocide looks like by the time that there are lessons to take away. So it feels like a very risky gamble and an extremely precarious situation. And the truth is, we don't have good options in this election. We have, we have to pick between genocide and genocide plus, the plus being fascism and everything else that Trump brings along.
There you go. I mean, that is where the risk really is too great. It's maybe not the best time to try to teach one of the candidates a lesson if the alternative will plunge the Palestinians into something even darker. Let me, though, branch out a little bit more into the wider region. Kadhim, I'll come to you. Try to help us understand, I mean, who in the broader Middle East, what are the dynamics here? Who really likes the U.S. versus who doesn't? And how, arguably, those differences in where they stand, Saudi versus Iran, for example, have kind of helped the U.S. to successfully divide, even somewhat conquer, countries in the Middle East.
Right. So the U.S. has not really been liked in the Middle East. We know that. There is an ideology, there is a politics, a social mood toward the U.S., but U.S. always needed. When it's all about them if you do, them if you don't. When George W. Bush administration interfered a lot in the Middle East, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan and some other places, the Arab or the Middle East say, hey, we don't want you to be there, leave us. Then when Obama, during his 8 years administration, tried to neglect the Middle East, tried to stay away, and he shifted his focus toward the South Asia, the Arab, when they say, hey, help us, there is something called the Arab Spring, and the chaos started Libya, Syria, Yemen, even Egypt, Tunisia, all these countries, they were affected by the Arab Spring when Obama decided to not interfere and not to get involved in that. So them you do, them if you don't. U.S. Exactly. is the greatest nation in the world. It's a superpower, and it's always been needed by the Middle East, either for protection or either for financial gain.
Okay. Rami, would you agree there? And also, tell us where Lebanon actually stands. There is so much at stake for Lebanon right now, given the aggression that it's facing. So how much do Lebanese see this vote and these candidates affecting their lives going forward?
Well, I agree with basically everything that's been said, and it shows the complexity of the situation. This is not a black or white either or. The United States is a very powerful country, and it has some really terrific elements inside it, some great values, amazing people, wonderful institutions, but it's also the greatest imperial destroyer of order in the modern Arab world since World War II. And the problem is not that the U.S. has these imperial ambitions of controlling the region. It sees the region as a monopoly game where you move things around and you get more power. It's not just that it's an imperial power, it's an amateur imperial power. They don't know how to do imperialism like the old days of the French and the British. So they just make a mess of every country they go to, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, all over the place. And this is the problem. And most Arab people feel positive about the U.S. They like its values, they like its opportunities, they want to send their kids there, but they don't like the United States being a genocidal state. And this most important legacy of destruction is that the U.S. has consistently and fervently supported terrible autocrats all over the region who have suppressed the individual ideas and values and will of their own people and the decency of their Islamic and Christian and even Jewish Arab religions. And so this is a real problem that there's no straightforward decision about the U.S. And this moment, though, is historic because for the first time ever, certainly in my 55 years of covering these events, starting back in the '68 elections in the U.S. when I was following the demonstrations and stuff. This is the first time Arab Americans and Muslim Americans have a possibility to influence a major election, and they have started to form a coalition with other Americans who are like-minded, Jews, progressive Jews, Black Americans, etc., many others. So this is really a powerful, important moment, and we shouldn't decide if it's the right thing to do only on the basis of will it bring in Trump. Trump and Harris are going to be almost identical on the Middle East as they are on almost everything else. So I wouldn't take that.
Rami, I mean, this is where I'm still unconvinced. How are you convinced that they would be exactly the same when you know? We spoke about this before. There is no way a Democratic administration ever would have made Jerusalem the capital of Israel. Trump was happy to do that. He wants to back his friend because many argue he shares the long-term vision of basically handing all of the Palestinian territories to Israel.
And the Democrats have done almost exactly the same thing, except supporting Jerusalem's annexations or annexation of the Golan Heights. And there's really very little difference between them. It's very cosmetic. It's all transactional domestic American politics. We've had enough of this for 40, 50 years now. Very clear.
Hassan, I'm sure you're relieved to hear that then, that, you know, perhaps your campaign wouldn't damage anything more for Palestinians, but you also heard that there is a history of failed U.S. policy, not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere, and that maybe this isn't the best time to take the risk that Omar was talking about, to teach a candidate or an administration a lesson, if the flip side is how much worse it could get.
This, in fact, in our assessment, is the perhaps greatest historic opportunity that has come to people of conscience with respect to foreign policy. As you mentioned, American foreign policy has been pernicious, a reign of bombardment and torture. As someone who's been detained and tortured by Israeli forces while we were calling out for a peaceful end of occupation, I could tell you that it was a Biden administration that couldn't care while I was in prison after I returned. These two administrations, the Republicans and Democrats, for the past 76 years and now ever more, have shared the same policies, allowing Netanyahu and other leaders in Israel to do as they please. It is curious to even consider the possibility of something worse when we're talking about bombings in the tens of thousands, tons that have fallen on Gaza, raining on an innocent people on the verge of disintegration, bombs that go well beyond Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people who are being displaced and attacked. This is not the picture of something that's a lesser anything. This is truly the most devastating attack that has happened in the modern period, a genocide before our eyes, something that we have the only option but to punish, to ensure that a clear message has been sent and that Democrats and Republicans learn. And I could tell you a lot of people don't realize this, but as we started to ban Biden last year, people were worried about our leverage. Both parties are now running after us, abandoning Harris, asking for our endorsement, begging, changing their position, saying that people in the Republican Party themselves want the vote of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans while we don't endorse them. This shows that it won't just be a mere photocopy of the previous administration. We do not ever support Trump. As you know, we endorse Jill Stein.
Yeah. We actually tried to get her on the program today. She was unfortunately too busy to participate. But let me come back to the studio in Kadhim, because it's not just about the Israel-Palestine conflict right now. Trump is also a deeply polarizing figure for his rhetoric, especially toward Iran. We can't forget that he pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, that the previous administration had spent, endless hours of diplomacy trying to secure. The world, most U.S. allies were all behind it. He dropped it the second he got into office. Is there a risk here that his rhetoric again toward Iran, the provocative action that he might take, could push Iran into a corner that might make it respond even harder against Israel and the U.S.?
I think Trump wants that to happen. I think he wants to just instigate them and push them to the corner to react. Iran has not reacted even after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. It was kind of like staged attack. Even those recent attacks on Israel, They're ineffective. But I don't think Iran will just exceed its limits and go to do something that's out of the ordinary or something that will damage the U.S. or damage Israel. Iran playing it really well right now and is very, very careful. Trump, if he becomes the president, I think he has nothing to lose. He has only 4 years. He can't extend because the Amendment 51 would not allow him. 22nd, right. Amendment 22nd will not allow him to run again. So he has nothing to lose. Therefore, he can do whatever in his head. And Trump, he's the businessman. He's the one, he does not believe in consulting with other people. It's his decision, and the cabinet must implement the decision.
Yeah. Omar,
I can jump in on just
go
this point.
ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I think we are in an extremely precarious situation right now on the Iranian front. Obviously, Netanyahu wants a regional war. It's not difficult to see why he wants one, because he's stuck in a situation where there is no political out for him. And he's interested in dragging the U.S. into a direct military confrontation with Iran in order to have the U.S. take on his biggest rival, while Netanyahu essentially completes the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians under the fog of a devastating regional war. That's what he's going after. And you see this minor tension where Biden is allegedly calling for restraint with Netanyahu, saying, don't bomb the nuclear facilities. And then you have Trump going on TV and saying, I'm encouraging Netanyahu to bomb the nuclear facilities in Iran. So that is a point. I think we're in an extremely dangerous situation. And this kind of encouragement that Trump is giving publicly to Netanyahu is suggesting that Trump sees a benefit from creating an energy crisis, a regional crisis right before the election, in order for Trump to be able to point at that and say, this is the world that Biden gave you, now vote for me. And frankly, I don't think anybody can really take into account how widely this could get out of hand. We are set up in a situation in which there are no off-ramps anymore, in which the escalation is coming, and it has the potential to utterly destroy the region and kill, literally, not figuratively, millions of people if this thing gets completely out of hand. It's just an extremely, extremely dangerous situation. And it's worth noting that Trump is egging Netanyahu on to take it all the way. And I guess the coming days will show us how far this is going to go and how wide-ranging Israel's attack on Iran is going to be. Because if it is as wide-ranging as the Israelis are claiming it's going to be, then we are set for a very, very dark moment for the region.
Rami,
with untold consequences.
You are saying both candidates are essentially the same, but what Omar just described there in that scenario, it's not the same. This is incredibly dangerous.
Of course, Omar is correct. They're not identical completely. But from the perspective of either an average American or an Arab or Muslim American who's got family interests and personal interests in the region, there's not a lot of difference between what's going to happen to the Middle East if either candidate wins. The Democrats have shown very clearly since the days of Richard Nixon's presidency that they will go along with the mainstream U.S. Power elite's position, which is heavily defined by Israeli interests, and successfully so for a long time. And still today, you can get about 75 members of the Senate automatically supporting any resolution. Okay. That's less than the 100 would have gotten before, but so there's change. But no, there's no essential big difference between them, in my view.
I'll tell you what, last minute, Kadhim, I'm going to finish with you because there's another factor involved here. And if there is serious provocation in the Middle East, Daesh, we've heard many analysts now say that it could easily raise its head again, that threat has actually been ignored a little too much for some's liking, and that there's a risk here of that becoming another front against the United States in its proxies. Where do you stand there?
Right. ISIS as an ideology still exists, but as a foot soldiers, we're not going to see the black banners and the Hilux pickup truck, going through a street in Al-Anbar or Mosul or Raqqa. There will be a small contingency, but the Iraqi forces right now, I mean, this week, they've been doing a great job. Iraqi Air Force killed one of the
What about their
Walis.
proxies, though, in the Yemen, in other areas that are not under any control of an organized army?
Yes, and I went back to the Twitter, and I've seen all this sectarian rhetoric, Shia versus Sunni, Sunni versus Shia. It's growing, and it's getting worse, and probably that's what is going to get ISIS or all the extremists or any extremist organization to interfere and to come back and conduct their terrorist operations. But I don't think right now ISIS or even Al-Qaeda, they have that manpower and they have the will to come out of the surface and act as the way they acted in 2014, 2015.
Do you expect them very quickly to be provoked more by one candidate than another, though?
I think Trump will be the one.
Okay, to provoke them.
Yeah.
Into who knows what. Okay, Kadhim, that will have to be, unfortunately, the final word for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank sincerely all four of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X. And do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.